Morning everybody, welcome to another edition of the Lab 207 webcast. My name is Mr. Kite and I will be hanging out with you today as we continue on in our very long series about the living world. Today's topic is respiration, and just going to give you a heads up, like yesterday, this is not meant to be an exhaustive study of all respiratory systems of all animals. It's just meant to demonstrate a couple of major principles that you should be aware of when thinking about respiration. So let me get you your objectives and we'll get going. By the end of the video, know the following things. First, apply the concept of partial pressure to gas exchange. This is the mechanism that drives respiration. Describe respiratory surfaces found in various animals. Explain mammalian respiration. And finally, discuss regulations of breathing in humans. Not regulations, discuss regulation of breathing in humans. So, as is the case with this series, I've tried to start out every video with a little why. Like, why do we have this thing? So why respiration? Well, if you think back to, a long time ago when we were talking about the body making energy, you'll remember the process of cellular respiration. Cellular respiration is how all of the ATP for our body is made. That ATP then goes on to fuel the processes in our body. That process of cellular respiration that requires ATP needs oxygen if it is going to function. Without oxygen, no cellular respiration, no ATP, no us. So that's the whole reason we need respiration, is to get that oxygen in order to fuel our cellular respiration. Before we start actually talking about how respiration works, you need to understand this concept of partial pressure. And this is almost a way of talking about concentration gradients for gases, but let me give you a quick little explanation of it. So let's say you have got a column of air pushing down on your head. Boom. And we will say that we are at sea level, so this column of air is exerting 760 millimeters of mercury worth of pressure. Millimeters of mercury is just a way of measuring atmospheric pressure. 1 atmosphere, sea level, is 760 millimeters of mercury. So that is the total pressure that is pushing down on your head. Now, our atmosphere by composition is 78% nitrogen, sorry, that should have circles on it, nitrogen, 21% oxygen, and 1% other. So of all of these gases that are pushing down on you that add up to 760 milligrams of mercury, 21% of it is oxygen. So that means that oxygen exerts 21% of the pressure. You'd have to do a quick calculation, but whatever 21% of 760 is, that would be the partial pressure of oxygen. It's the pressure that is exerted just by oxygen. So if we are thinking of a situation where gas exchange is happening, let's say this is a blood vessel, gases are going to move from high partial pressure to low partial pressure. So let's say that some oxygen has just entered the lungs. So we're going to say this is the lungs right there. Obviously, the partial pressure of the oxygen that has just entered your lungs is going to be higher than the partial pressure of oxygen in a red blood cell. That's your green red blood cell. So because partial pressure of oxygen is higher out here, it is going to move this direction and hook up with your red blood cell and be taken to the rest of the body. Now, contrasting this red blood cell that has come to the lungs has a lot of CO2 in it, so this means that its partial pressure of CO2 is higher than the CO2 partial pressure in the lungs, so CO2, because of partial pressure difference, is going to move into the air of the lungs. So that's basically how gas exchange happens, is it's based on that idea of partial pressure. Also, talking about partial pressure and respiration, we need to talk about respiratory media. That's just the thing that is carrying oxygen. So obviously for us, our respiratory media is air, and for a lot of the living organisms, their respiratory media is water. So for us, we've got it simple. Air is not viscous, it's not heavy, it's got a high oxygen concentration in it. So for us, respiration doesn't take much energy, and really it doesn't even have to be all that efficient because it happens so easily. Air is easy to move in and out of the lungs, it's got a lot of oxygen in it, so simple. If you're an aquatic organism, a lot of your energy is spent on respiration because comparatively speaking, water has so little dissolved oxygen in it. Also, it's a viscous, dense material, so it is hard to move around. So aquatic organisms spend a greater proportion of their energy on respiration than do terrestrial organisms. And we'll talk on the next slide about some structures they have that are adapted to pulling oxygen out of water. Now, depending on the type of organism you are, you're going to have a different strategy for respiration. Vertebrates like us, we have got lungs. We'll talk about those in a second. If you are an insect, you have got tracheae, which is an interesting system. You can see our cockroach right here. Tracheae is basically a series of tubes that run through the body and open to the outside. So each one of these tracheae has got a little hole in the exoskeleton that corresponds with it. Air diffuses into there, and then the tracheae just branch and come into contact with cells directly. So air comes in, goes through the tracheae, and then just diffuses directly into the cells based on that partial pressure we were just talking about. If an organism needs more air to go in, it can move its body about to get some air pumping in and out a little bit, but it doesn't have lungs or anything like that. Air just moves through the tracheae. If you are an aquatic organism, you have got gills, which are a structure that is specially set up for respiration in water. And they do still work on this idea of partial pressure. So let's say here's a blood vessel in the gills. It's got all of its red blood cells in it. Out here we've got the water. And just like we were talking about with partial pressure previously, the partial pressure of oxygen, dissolved oxygen in the water, is going to be higher than that in the blood. So O2 is going to diffuse across the gill membrane into and be picked up by the red blood cells. CO2 is higher in the blood than it is in the water, so it's going to diffuse out into the water, and that's basically how their respiration works. So rather than just breathing in air, the contact between the gills and the water is where the respiration actually occurs. For mammals, this is basically how it works, and I got several things that I need to break down here. First, you need to know the structure that makes this happen. I'm going to draw you the crudest, simplest diagram ever, but basically for us, here's what we got. You've got your trachea. The trachea branches off into two bronchi. Each of those bronchi break into smaller branches called bronchioles, and each of those branches ends in a cluster of sacs called alveoli. So that's where you get the lung shape that you are kind of accustomed to seeing. So if you're looking at your diagram here, this would be a bronchiole right here, and these little grape-looking things are alveoli. Alveoli are the functional structures of respiration. As you can see, they are wrapped in capillary beds. So when we breathe in, the air travels down through our bronchi, through the bronchi, into the bronchioles, and then into the alveoli. In the alveoli, that is where that gas exchange happens based on partial pressure. So this is the functional unit. Obviously, these surfaces need to be moist, or gas exchange can't happen because that requires a moist surface in order to exchange gases. I've got right here a negative pressure. So what this means is that our breathing is based on negative pressure. What happens is when you breathe out, your lungs kind of go to their normal state. Your muscles and your ribs contract, they push down, and they let the lungs kind of collapse. Now, when we need to take a breath in, what happens is the muscles in between your ribs lift up, which allows your chest to expand. When it expands, the air pressure from outside your body actually forces air into your lungs because there's higher pressure outside your body than there is inside your body. Your lungs are actually like a vacuum. There's no air in there unless your ribs open up and allow them to expand because of air pressure. So your ribs open, air pressure goes in your mouth, it causes your lungs to expand, and you take in air. And then when we breathe out, that just is your ribs collapsing back down, forcing that air out of your mouth. And that is called a negative pressure system because it is the negative pressure in our lungs that allows air from the outside to rush in. Regarding control of breathing, and I know I'm rushing through a lot of stuff, I'm just trying to kind of get through this today. Control of breathing in humans is focused in a brain structure called the medulla oblongata, which is found deep inside of your brain, and it does its regulation based on pH. So as we are exercising, as we are moving, as our body is going through cellular respiration, we know that the waste product is carbon dioxide. carbon dioxide, when it dissolves in the blood, hooks up with water to form carbonic acid, which is H2CO3. So obviously, the more carbon dioxide you have in your blood, the more acidic your blood is going to be, which means the lower the pH of your blood is going to be. So your blood's pH affects the pH of cerebrospinal fluid, which is the fluid that surrounds your brain and spinal cord and stuff like that. So what happens is as your blood becomes more acidic, it makes the CS fluid more acidic, which works on the medulla oblongata, and it tells it, hey, we need to increase the rate of breathing so that we can dump off CO2. Also, we need to increase the rate of circulation so that we can get more CO2 to the lungs and take more oxygen in. So basically what happens is the medulla oblongata gets the signal that, hey, the blood's really acidic because there's a lot of carbon dioxide. We need to balance this out. And then you kind of get a feedback mechanism going on where respiration and circulation will go into overdrive until pH is balanced, and then things will settle back down. I think this is the last slide for the day. So, we need to talk about respiratory pigments. Without these, we wouldn't be alive because, yeah, we breathe in oxygen all day long. Some of that oxygen just diffuses into the plasma of your blood, but not very much at all. I read somewhere, I think it might be in the book, that if it were just left to blood plasma, our body during exercise would have to circulate something like 555 liters of blood every minute to keep us alive, which is impossible. So, in red blood cells, you have got a pigment called hemoglobin, picture of it there on the right. It is a respiratory pigment that carries iron, and it is a pigment that is very good at binding to oxygen. So this hemoglobin in your red blood cells is what allows oxygen to be carried through the body. It's like a little shuttle. So when you breathe in those lungs, and that partial pressure forces the oxygen towards the blood, it is then picked up by red blood cells using hemoglobin. There's another respiratory pigment called myoglobin that hangs out in our muscles, and it also is able to store oxygen. Not nearly as much as hemoglobin, but it is another oxygen storing pigment. And breathe out. I think that's all. Thank you for sticking with me on this trek through respiration. My name is Mr. Kite. This has been the Lab 207 webcast, and hopefully we'll see you again.